The desert stretched endlessly under the scorching afternoon sun, its red rocks and scattered cacti creating a landscape that seemed forgotten by time. Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as he guided his horse, Thunder, along the narrow canyon trail. He had been tracking the missing cattle for 3 days now, following hoofprints and broken brush deeper into the wilderness than he had ever ventured before. Jake was not like the other cowboys in Dusty Creek. At 28, he preferred solitude to the rowdy saloons and card games that occupied his fellow ranch hands. His weathered face told stories of countless hours under the sun, but his green eyes held a gentleness that set him apart. While others saw him as quiet and mysterious, Jake simply found peace in the vast emptiness of the frontier. The trail led him through a series of narrow passages between towering rock formations. Thunder's hooves echoed against the stone walls, the only sound in the oppressive silence. As they emerged into a wider canyon, Jake noticed something that made him pull up short. The ground ahead was scorched in a perfect circle, about 30 feet across. The sand had been turned to glass in some spots, and the air still shimmered with residual heat. Thunder snorted nervously, backing away from the strange sight. Jake dismounted, his boots crunching on the crystallized sand as he approached the circle. He had heard stories from other cowboys about strange lights in the sky, unexplained phenomena that the older folks dismissed as desert mirages or lightning strikes. But this was different. The pattern was too perfect, too deliberate. As he examined the edge of the circle, a sound caught his attention. It was faint, almost like the wind, but there was something else mixed in. Something that sounded almost like crying. Jake looked around, trying to locate the source. The sound seemed to be coming from a cluster of large boulders on the far side of the scorched area. Moving carefully across the glass-smooth ground, Jake made his way toward the rocks. The crying became clearer as he approached, and he realized it was definitely human. Though there was something strange about the tone, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Behind the largest boulder, Jake discovered something that would change his life forever. A young woman sat with her back against the stone, her wrists bound tightly with what looked like metal wire that gleamed with an otherworldly sheen. But she was unlike any woman Jake had ever seen. Her skin had a subtle blue tint that became more pronounced in the shadows, and her hair was a silvery color that seemed to catch and reflect light in impossible ways. Her eyes, when she looked up at him through her tears, were a deep violet that held depths Jake could not fathom. She wore clothing that appeared to be made of a material that shifted between colors as she moved. And despite her obvious distress, there was something regal about her bearing. The woman stopped crying when she saw Jake, her violet eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him feel as though she was looking directly into his soul. She spoke then, but the words were in a language he had never heard, musical and flowing like water over stones. Yet somehow, as she continued to speak, Jake began to understand her meaning, as if the words were translating themselves in his mind. She was afraid, but not of him. She was afraid of something else, something that had bound her here and left her in this desolate place. As Jake approached slowly, his hands raised to show he meant no harm, he could see that the metal restraints around her wrists were not like any rope or chain he knew. They seemed to pulse with a faint inner light, and when he looked closely, he could see symbols moving along their surface like living text. "Easy there," Jake said softly, the same tone he used with frightened horses. "I'm not going to hurt you. Let me see if I can help you with those." The woman's expression changed as he spoke. Her eyes widened with what might have been hope, and she extended her bound hands toward him. As Jake knelt beside her, he noticed that her skin was warm despite its unusual color, and when his fingers brushed against the strange restraints, he felt a shock that ran up his arm like electricity. The metal wire was incredibly thin but stronger than anything Jake had ever encountered. His knife, sharp enough to cut leather with ease, barely scratched the surface. As he worked at the bindings, the woman continued to speak in her melodious language. Gradually, Jake began to understand more of what she was saying. Her name was something that sounded like music when she said it, but in his mind, he heard it as Lyra. She was not from this place, not from this world. The scorched circle behind them was where her vessel had crashed, damaged by something she called the hunters. They had pursued her across the vast emptiness between stars. And when her ship finally failed, she had barely escaped before it was destroyed. The hunters had found her hiding among the rocks and bound her with restraints designed to hold beings like herself. But something had frightened them away before they could complete whatever dark purpose they had in mind. They would return, she told him, and when they did, they would not make the same mistake twice. As Jake worked at the restraints, using every tool he had and applying steady pressure, he began to notice that the symbols moving along the metal surface were reacting to his touch. They pulsed brighter when he pressed certain spots, and dimmer when he touched others. It was as if the bindings were somehow reading him, trying to determine if he was friend or foe. Lyra watched his progress with growing amazement. She had expected the primitive being she first saw to be unable to even comprehend the technology that held her, let alone find a way to defeat it. But there was something different about this human, something that allowed him to interact with systems designed for much more advanced minds. "You are not like the others of your kind," she said, and this time Jake heard her words clearly in his own language. "There is something within you that resonates with the old frequencies." Jake paused in his work, looking up at her violet eyes. "I don't know what you mean by that. I just know you need help, and I can't leave you tied up like an animal." As he resumed his efforts, Jake told Lyra about himself. He explained about the missing cattle that had led him to this remote place, about his life on the ranch, about the strange dreams he sometimes had of vast star fields and distant worlds. As he spoke, he noticed that Lyra was studying him with increasing intensity, as if she was recognizing something important. The restraints suddenly gave way with a sound like breaking crystal. The metal wire crumbled to dust between Jake's fingers, and Lyra rubbed her freed wrists gratefully. Where the bindings had been, Jake could see faint marks on her blue-tinged skin, but they were already beginning to fade. "How did you do that?" Lyra asked, examining the pile of metallic dust that had moments before been unbreakable restraints. Those bonds were crafted by the vanguard of Kethmore, designed to hold any being that possesses the ancient gifts. Yet you dissolved them with nothing but determination and touch. Jake brushed the strange dust from his hands, noticing that it left a faint tingling sensation on his skin. "I don't know. I just kept trying different approaches until something worked. Maybe they were damaged when you crashed." Lyra shook her head, her silver hair catching the sunlight. "No. That is not possible. There is something else. Something about you that you do not yet understand." She stood gracefully, and Jake was surprised to see that she was taller than most women he knew, with a lithe strength that was immediately apparent. "We need to leave this place," she continued, scanning the canyon walls above them. "The hunters will return before the sun sets, and they will bring reinforcements. If they find us here, we will both suffer fates worse than simple death." Jake looked toward Thunder, who had been nervously pacing at the edge of the scorched circle. "My horse can carry us both, but he's already tired from 3 days of hard travel. Where exactly are we supposed to go?" Lyra closed her eyes and raised her face toward the sky. For a moment, she remained perfectly still, as if listening to something only she could hear. Then her eyes snapped open, and she pointed toward a narrow passage on the western side of the canyon. "There is a place of power in that direction, a site that your people built long ago but have forgotten. If we can reach it before darkness falls, we may find sanctuary and perhaps even a way to contact others of my kind who can help us." As they prepared to leave, Jake found himself studying Lyra more closely. Despite her otherworldly appearance, there was something familiar about her, something that nagged at the edges of his memory. She moved with a grace that seemed almost supernatural. But when she looked at him, he saw vulnerability beneath her alien beauty. "Why are they hunting you?" Jake asked as he helped her mount Thunder behind him. "What did you do to make these hunters so determined to capture you?" Lyra was quiet for a long moment as they began their journey toward the western passage. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight of sorrow that made Jake's heart ache. "I carry something that they desperately want. Something that could change the balance of power across countless worlds. My people sent me to hide it in a place where the hunters would never think to look. But they discovered our plan and have pursued me relentlessly." She paused, her arms tightening around Jake's waist, as Thunder picked his way carefully through the rocky terrain. "What I carry is not a weapon or a treasure in the way your kind would understand such things. It is knowledge, the location of something that has been lost for thousands of your years, something that could save my dying world or destroy everything if it falls into the wrong hands." As they rode through the narrow passage, Jake felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He had started this day looking for missing cattle, and now he found himself protecting an alien refugee, carrying secrets that could affect worlds he had never imagined. The rational part of his mind told him this was impossible, that he was experiencing some kind of desert-induced hallucination. But the warmth of Lyra's arms around him, the strange tingling that still lingered in his hands from touching the alien restraints, and the genuine fear he heard in her voice, all convinced him that this was terrifyingly real. Whatever lay ahead, he knew there was no turning back now. The passage opened into another canyon, this one filled with strange rock formations that seemed almost deliberately arranged. As they progressed deeper into this new landscape, Jake noticed that Thunder's nervousness was increasing. The horse's ears were constantly moving, as if he was hearing sounds that Jake could not detect. "They are coming," Lyra whispered suddenly, her voice tight with fear. "I can feel them approaching. The hunters have found our trail." Jake urged Thunder into a faster pace, though the rocky ground made speed dangerous. Behind them, he could hear something that might have been the sound of wind through stone passages. But there was an artificial quality to it that made his skin crawl. "How much farther to this place you mentioned?" he called over his shoulder. "Not far now," Lyra replied, pointing ahead to where the canyon made a sharp turn to the left. "Beyond that bend lies the entrance to the sacred site." "But Jake, you must understand something important. Once we enter that place, there will be no going back to your simple life. The knowledge I carry will awaken things within you that have been sleeping since your birth. Are you prepared for such a change?" Jake considered her words as they rounded the bend, and what he saw ahead took his breath away. Built into the canyon wall was a structure that clearly predated anything he knew of human civilization in this region. The stonework was intricate and precise, covered with symbols that seemed to shift and move when he looked directly at them. Most unsettling of all, the symbols looked remarkably similar to the ones he had seen on Lyra's restraints. "What is this place?" he asked as they approached the ancient structure. "Your ancestors called it many names," Lyra explained. "But my people know it as a threshold. A place where the barriers between worlds grow thin. It was built by those who came before, beings who understood the connections that link all inhabited worlds across the cosmos." As they dismounted before the mysterious entrance, Jake felt a strange familiarity wash over him. He had never been to this place before, but something deep within his mind recognized it, as if he was remembering, rather than seeing it for the first time. The sound behind them was growing louder now, and when Jake turned to look back down the canyon, he could see shapes moving in the shadows. Shapes that seemed to flow rather than walk. Terror gripped him as he realized that whatever was pursuing them was no longer bothering to hide its approach. "Quickly," Lyra urged, grasping his hand and pulling him toward the ancient doorway. "We must reach the inner chamber before they arrive." As they crossed the threshold together, Jake felt the world around him shift in ways he could not describe. The very air seemed to thicken, and the symbols on the walls began to pulse with an inner light that cast dancing shadows throughout the passage ahead. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit stopped abruptly, as if the hunters had encountered some invisible barrier. But Jake knew this was only a temporary reprieve. Whatever lay ahead in the depths of this ancient place would test him in ways he could not yet imagine, and the choices he made in the coming hours would determine not only his own fate, but the fate of worlds he was only beginning to understand existed. The air inside the ancient structure hummed with energy that made Jake's teeth ache. As his eyes adjusted to the strange, pulsing light that emanated from the symbols carved into the stone walls, he realized they were standing in a corridor that stretched much deeper into the canyon wall than should have been possible. The passage was perfectly straight and lined with doorways that opened into chambers filled with shadows. Lyra moved ahead of him with confident steps, her silver hair seeming to absorb and reflect the alien light in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Jake followed, his hand instinctively resting on the grip of his revolver. Though he suspected conventional weapons would be useless against whatever they might encounter in this place. The builders of this threshold were ancestors of your kind, Lyra explained as they walked, her voice echoing strangely in the corridor. But they were far more advanced than the humans who came after. They understood that consciousness itself could be a tool for bridging the gaps between worlds. Jake ran his fingers along the wall as they passed, feeling the symbols pulse with warmth under his touch. How do you know so much about human history? And why do these markings look so familiar? Lyra stopped at a junction where the corridor branched into 3 separate passages. She placed her hand against a larger symbol carved into the wall between the openings, and immediately the entire junction filled with a soft, blue-white light. Images began to appear in the air around them, 3-dimensional pictures that showed the construction of this very building. Your people were not alone when they first arrived on this world, she said, gesturing to the floating images that showed humans working alongside tall, graceful beings who looked remarkably similar to Lyra herself. My race, the Zephyrians, have been guardians and teachers to developing civilizations for countless millennia. We helped your ancestors build these thresholds as safe havens and communication centers. In the images, Jake could see humans and Zephyrians working together to carve the symbols into the stone, their combined efforts creating structures that pulsed with the same energy he could feel around him now. But then the images darkened, showing ships descending from the sky, sleek vessels that disgorged warriors in dark armor who moved like shadows given form. The hunters, Lyra said bitterly, also called the devourers. By those who have faced them, they consume knowledge and power from every civilization they encounter, growing stronger with each conquest. When they discovered the alliance between humans and Zephyrians, they launched a campaign to destroy both our peoples. The images showed great battles fought both on Earth and in the starfields above. Jake watched in amazement as he saw ancient humans wielding weapons that fired beams of pure light, fighting alongside Zephyrian warriors whose very presence seemed to bend space around them. But the hunters were relentless, and eventually, the Allied forces were overwhelmed. The survivors among your people lost their advanced knowledge and reverted to simpler ways of living, Lyra continued. The thresholds were hidden and forgotten, and my people retreated to our dying homeworld, believing that Earth was lost to the hunters forever. As the images faded, Jake found himself staring at Lyra with new understanding. But some of us kept the old knowledge, didn't we? That's why I could break your restraints, and why this place feels familiar to me. Lyra nodded, her violet eyes studying his face intently. The genetic memory runs deeper in some humans than others. You carry the bloodline of those who worked most closely with my people, which is why you can interact with our technology, and why you were drawn to this place. They chose the middle passage and continued deeper into the complex. The walls here were covered with what appeared to be a metallic mesh that sparkled like starlight. As they walked, Jake began to hear something that sounded almost like whispered conversations, though he could not make out any words. What am I hearing? He asked, pausing to listen more carefully. The voices of those who built this place, Lyra replied. The threshold stores not just knowledge, but the consciousness patterns of those who contributed to its creation. They are trying to communicate with you, but the connection is incomplete because the full awakening process was never completed. They emerged into a vast circular chamber with a domed ceiling that showed a perfect representation of the night sky. But this was not the sky as seen from Earth. Jake could see multiple moons, nebulae in colors he had never imagined, and star formations that spoke of unimaginable distances. At the center of the chamber stood a raised platform surrounded by a series of concentric circles carved into the floor. This is the heart of the threshold, Lyra said, approaching the platform reverently. From here, communication can be established with any other threshold in the galaxy, assuming they are still functional. Jake followed her onto the platform, and immediately the chamber came alive with activity. Beams of light shot up from the floor circles, creating a complex 3-dimensional map that filled the air above their heads. Thousands of points of light appeared, each one representing a world with a functioning threshold. But as Jake watched, many of the lights began to flicker and go dark. The hunters are accelerating their campaign, Lyra said grimly, reading the display with practiced ease. Entire star systems are going silent. Soon, there will be nowhere left to hide. She reached into a hidden pocket in her strange clothing and withdrew a small, crystalline device that pulsed with the same rhythm as her heartbeat. This contains the coordinates to the source, the original threshold from which all others were constructed. It is the only place in the universe where the hunters can be permanently stopped. But reaching it requires activating every remaining threshold simultaneously to create a bridge across the cosmos. Jake stared at the crystal, feeling waves of power emanating from it. "And you're supposed to hide this thing on Earth?" "Not hide," Lyra corrected. "Integrate it with the most powerful threshold on your world. The one that lies beneath this very structure. But the integration can only be performed by someone who carries both human and Zephyrian genetic patterns working together in perfect harmony." As she spoke, Jake began to understand the true magnitude of what she was asking. "You need me to help you with this process. That's why you weren't afraid when I found you. Why you seem to recognize something in me. The dreams you mentioned having, of star fields and distant worlds," Lyra said, stepping closer to him. "Those were not dreams at all. They were memories passed down through your bloodline, memories of the time when our peoples worked as one. The awakening process will restore those memories fully and grant you abilities that will seem impossible by the standards of your current civilization." Jake looked around the ancient chamber, at the star map still flickering above their heads, at the symbols that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his own heartbeat. Part of him wanted to refuse, to walk away from this responsibility and return to his simple life herding cattle across the desert. But a larger part, a part that felt like it had been waiting his entire life for this moment, knew that there was no going back. "What happens if we succeed?" he asked. "If we can activate the source," Lyra replied, "we can send a signal that will awaken dormant thresholds throughout the galaxy. Civilizations that have been in hiding will emerge. And together, we can finally mount an effective resistance against the hunters. Your world will once again take its place among the star-faring peoples of the cosmos." "And if we fail?" Lyra's expression grew somber. "Then, the hunters will eventually consume every advanced civilization in the galaxy, including whatever remains of my people on our dying homeworld. Darkness will spread across the stars until nothing remains but empty worlds orbiting cold suns." As if summoned by her words, a sound reached them from the corridors beyond the chamber. It was the same flowing, unnatural sound they had heard in the canyon, but now it was much closer, and accompanied by what sounded like metal scraping against stone. "They have found a way past the outer barriers," Lyra said, her face pale with fear. "We must begin the integration process immediately, before they can reach the heart of the threshold." She placed the crystal device in the center of the platform, where it began to hover and spin slowly. Immediately, the chamber's energy levels increased dramatically, and Jake could feel power coursing through the floor beneath his feet. "Place your hands on the crystal," Lyra instructed, positioning herself on the opposite side of the platform. "But be warned. Once the process begins, it cannot be stopped. You will experience the full awakening of your ancestral memories, and your consciousness will be forever changed." Jake hesitated for only a moment before reaching out and touching the crystal. The moment his skin made contact, the world exploded into light and sensation. Memories that were not his own flooded through his mind. Images of space travel, of worlds filled with crystalline cities, of technologies that seemed like magic. He saw the first meetings between humans and Zephyrians, the wonder and excitement as two species discovered they could communicate not just through words, but through direct consciousness transfer. But along with the wonders came the horrors. He experienced the first hunter attacks, felt the terror of entire civilizations as their knowledge and culture were consumed and their people enslaved or destroyed. He saw the desperate evacuation of Earth's advanced settlements, the painful decision to abandon centuries of progress in order to preserve some seed of hope for the future. Through it all, he felt Lyra's presence in his mind, her consciousness intertwining with his as they together channeled the power needed to integrate the source coordinates with the threshold systems. He could sense her amazement at the depth of ancestral memory he carried, and her growing hope that they might actually succeed in their desperate mission. The crystal began to pulse faster, and streams of energy started flowing from it into the carved circles on the floor. The star map above them shifted and changed, showing new connections forming between the scattered threshold worlds. For the first time in millennia, the galaxy's communication network was coming back to life. But as the process neared completion, the sounds from the corridors grew much louder. Jake could hear what sounded like metal beings moving through the ancient passages, their presence causing the very stones to crack and shift. The hunters had finally breached the threshold's defenses and were racing toward the heart chamber. "Hold the connection," Lyra urged, her own hands glowing with energy as she channeled power into the crystal. "We are almost finished." Jake gritted his teeth and poured every ounce of will into maintaining contact with the device, even as the power flowing through him threatened to tear his consciousness apart. The awakened memories were settling into his mind now, becoming part of him rather than foreign intrusions. He could feel abilities awakening that no human had possessed for thousands of years. The first hunter appeared in the chamber entrance just as the crystal gave a final, brilliant pulse and settled into a stable configuration. The creature was tall and humanoid in basic shape, but its body seemed to be made of living shadow wrapped around a core of malevolent intelligence. When it spoke, its voice was like the sound of stars dying. "The awakening will not save you," it said, raising a weapon that seemed to bend light around itself. "We have consumed the knowledge of 1,000 worlds. Your primitive defenses cannot stand against us." But as the hunter prepared to fire, Jake discovered that the awakening process had given him more than just memories. Power flowed through him now, the same energy that pulsed through the threshold systems. Without conscious thought, he raised his hand toward the creature and channeled that power outward. A beam of pure force struck the hunter, sending it flying back into the corridor. But even as it fell, Jake could hear more of the creatures approaching, their otherworldly voices echoing through the ancient passages. "The integration is complete," Lyra said, her eyes bright with triumph. "The source coordinates are now part of this threshold's matrix. When the time comes, we will be able to open the bridge to the original world." "How much time do we have?" Jake asked, helping her down from the platform as more hunters appeared in the chamber entrances. "Not long," she replied, looking at the star map that still flickered above them. "The signal we just sent will take time to reach the distant thresholds. We need to hold this position until enough of them respond to make the bridge possible." Jake drew his revolver, knowing it would be useless against the shadow creatures but needing the familiar weight in his hand. "Then I guess we make our stand here." As the hunters advanced into the chamber, their weapons charging with deadly energy, Jake felt a calm settle over him. The memories of his ancestors were clear now, and he understood what they had built in this place. The threshold was more than just a communication device or a refuge. It was a fortress designed to protect the knowledge and hope of entire civilizations. He and Lyra took positions on opposite sides of the chamber, their combined abilities creating a defensive barrier of energy that held the hunters at bay. But Jake could see more of the creatures gathering in the corridors beyond, and he knew that their small victory was only the beginning of a much larger battle. The real question was whether they could hold out long enough for help to arrive, or whether the ancient threshold would become their tomb as well as their sanctuary. As the first exchange of energy blasts lit up the chamber, Jake found himself thinking not of the cattle he had been tracking, or the simple life he was leaving behind, but of the stars above and the countless worlds that were counting on them to succeed. The battle for the threshold's heart chamber raged for what felt like hours, though Jake's newly awakened senses told him that only minutes had actually passed. The hunters attacked in waves, their shadow forms flowing like liquid darkness as they tried to overwhelm the defensive barriers he and Lyra had erected. Each time one of the creatures fell to their combined energy blasts, two more seemed to take its place. Jake's revolver lay forgotten on the chamber floor. The awakening process had unlocked abilities he was still learning to control, allowing him to channel the threshold's power through his own body. Beams of brilliant light shot from his hands, each one precisely targeted to disrupt the dark energy that gave the hunters their form. But the effort was taking a tremendous toll on his human physiology. "I can't keep this up much longer," he called to Lyra, who was maintaining a constant stream of defensive energy while monitoring the star map above them. Sweat poured down his face, and his vision was beginning to blur from the strain. "The responses are coming in," Lyra replied, her voice tight with concentration. 17 thresholds have already acknowledged our signal, and more are awakening every moment. We need to hold out just a little longer. A massive hunter, larger than any they had faced so far, pushed through the entrance and raised what appeared to be a weapon of pure darkness. The air around it seemed to wither and die, and when it spoke, Jake could feel the words like ice in his bones. "Your struggle is pointless," the creature said, its voice echoing from multiple directions at once. "We have consumed empires that spanned entire galaxies. Two primitives hiding in an ancient ruin cannot stand against the inevitable darkness." The weapon fired, and a beam of absolute void struck their defensive barrier. For a moment, Jake felt the energy construct wavering, threatening to collapse under the assault. But as it began to fail, something unexpected happened. The symbols carved into the chamber walls suddenly blazed with new intensity, and Jake realized that other voices were joining the defense. The whispered conversations he had heard earlier were becoming clearer, and he could now make out individual words and phrases. The consciousness patterns stored within the threshold were awakening, drawn by the battle taking place in their sanctum. Ancient builders and long-dead guardians were adding their power to the defensive network. "Impossible," the large hunter snarled, its weapons sparking as feedback from the strengthened barrier damaged its systems. "The dead cannot return to fight. They were never truly dead," Lyra said, her eyes bright with understanding. "Consciousness is energy, and energy cannot be destroyed, only transformed. Every being who ever contributed to the construction of this place left part of themselves within its matrix." The chamber filled with translucent figures, ghostly images of humans and Zephyrians working together as they had millennia ago. They moved between Jake and Lyra, their ethereal hands gesturing in perfect synchronization as they wove patterns of protective energy around the central platform. Above them, the star map had expanded dramatically, showing hundreds of points of light as dormant thresholds throughout the galaxy responded to their signal. But Jake noticed that many of the lights were flickering unstably, as if the ancient systems were struggling to fully reactivate after their long slumber. "The network is not stable enough yet," he said, reading the display with knowledge he had inherited from his ancestors. "We need a way to boost the signal strength." Lyra looked at the crystal device, which was still hovering above the platform and pulsing with increasing urgency. "There is a way, but it requires someone to serve as a living conduit between the source coordinates and the threshold network. The energy levels involved would be far beyond what most beings could survive." Jake understood immediately what she was suggesting. "The awakening process changed me. I might be able to handle it, or it might destroy you completely," Lyra said, her violet eyes filled with concern. "The power we would need to channel could burn out your nervous system in seconds." More hunters were pouring into the chamber now, and even with the help of the ancient consciousness patterns, their defensive barriers were beginning to weaken. The massive hunter leader had repaired its weapon and was preparing for another assault, while smaller creatures moved to flank their position. "If we don't try something soon, we'll be overrun anyway," Jake pointed out, dodging an energy blast that turned part of the stone floor to slag. "And if this is the only way to save not just Earth but all the inhabited worlds in the galaxy, then I have to take the risk." Lyra hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "The process requires direct physical contact with the source crystal, while simultaneously maintaining connection to the threshold's core systems. You would need to place one hand on the device and the other on the primary control matrix beneath the platform." Jake looked down and saw that a section of the floor had retracted, revealing a complex array of crystalline structures that pulsed with the same energy as the floating device. The moment he touched both systems simultaneously, he would become a living bridge between the source and every threshold in the galaxy. "What about you?" he asked. "Once I start the process, I won't be able to help defend this place. The consciousness patterns will help me hold the hunters back," Lyra said, though Jake could see the uncertainty in her eyes. "And once the signal reaches full strength, reinforcements should begin arriving from the awakened worlds." A tremendous crash echoed through the chamber as the hunter leader's next attack shattered part of their barrier. Dark energy began seeping through the breach, and Jake knew they were out of time. "Do it now," Lyra urged, moving to intercept the advancing creatures with a wall of brilliant blue light. Jake knelt on the platform and placed his left hand on the source crystal. Immediately, power beyond anything he had ever imagined surged through his arm and into his body. But instead of destroying him as Lyra had feared, the energy seemed to merge with the awakened abilities he had inherited from his ancestors. He reached down with his right hand and grasped the primary control matrix. The moment the connection was complete, Jake felt his consciousness expand to encompass the entire galactic network. Through hundreds of thresholds scattered across countless worlds, he could sense the civilizations that had been hiding from the hunters for millennia. Desert peoples like his own, underground dwellers on frozen worlds, aquatic races in vast ocean planets, beings of pure energy existing within the hearts of stars. All of them were receiving the signal now, and Jake could feel their amazement as dormant technologies came back to life and long-lost knowledge began to resurface. But more importantly, he could sense their determination to finally strike back against the darkness that had driven them into hiding. The crystal above him pulsed with increasing frequency, and the star map showed a cascading effect as each newly awakened threshold sent activation signals to others in its region. Within minutes, the entire network was coming online for the first time in thousands of years. But the process was indeed taking a terrible toll on Jake's human body. He could feel his life force being drawn into the energy flow, used as fuel to maintain the impossible connection between dimensions. His vision was fading, and his heartbeat was becoming irregular as the power coursed through him. Through the growing haze, he saw Lyra fighting desperately against the advancing hunters. The consciousness patterns were helping her, but there were too many enemies and not enough defenders. The massive hunter leader had broken through their lines and was advancing on the platform where Jake knelt, its weapon trained directly at his head. "Your sacrifice changes nothing," the creature said, its voice filled with ancient malice. "We have faced desperate alliances before. In the end, all civilizations fall to the hunger of the void." But as it prepared to fire, something remarkable happened. The chamber filled with new light, not the blue-white glow of the threshold systems, but a golden radiance that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Figures began materializing around the platform, not the ghostly consciousness patterns from the chamber's memory banks, but solid, living beings. Reinforcements had arrived from the awakened worlds, tall Zephyrians in flowing robes that sparkled with embedded stars, reptilian warriors whose scales gleamed like polished metal, crystalline beings who seemed to be made of living light, and others whose forms were so alien Jake could barely comprehend them. They moved with coordinated precision, their various technologies and abilities combining to create a devastating assault on the hunter forces. The massive hunter leader found itself facing a Zephyrian commander, whose very presence seemed to bend space around him. When the creature tried to fire its void weapon, the blast was absorbed harmlessly into what appeared to be a pocket dimension, created by the commander's will. "The age of hiding is over," the Zephyrian said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the chamber's walls resonate. "The galaxy remembers its strength, and we will no longer cower before the shadow." The battle turned quickly after that. The various allied forces had technologies and abilities the hunters had never encountered, having been developed in secret during the long years of hiding. The shadow creatures found themselves outmatched for the first time in millennia, their ancient tactics useless against coordinated resistance. But Jake was barely aware of the conflict raging around him. His consciousness was spread across hundreds of light years, maintaining the network connection that was allowing the allied forces to coordinate their efforts. He could feel his body failing, his human physiology simply not designed to channel such vast amounts of cosmic energy. Then Lyra was beside him, her hands touching his shoulders as she added her own strength to his failing reserves. "Hold on," she whispered, her voice somehow reaching him across the dimensional barriers his mind was spanning. "The network is almost fully stabilized. Just a little longer." Through their shared connection, Jake could sense what was happening throughout the galaxy. On world after world, hidden civilizations were emerging from their shelters and activating ancient defenses. Hunter fleets that had terrorized star systems for centuries found themselves facing unified resistance from races they had thought extinct. The darkness that had seemed inevitable was being pushed back by the combined light of 1,000 worlds. Finally, the critical moment arrived. The network had achieved full synchronization, and the source coordinates were locked into every active threshold. Jake felt the vast energies stabilizing as the systems took over the burden he had been carrying. Slowly, carefully, he released his grip on the control matrix and lifted his hand from the crystal. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. His consciousness snapped back into his own body like a rubber band, and he collapsed onto the platform, gasping for air. Every muscle in his body ached, and his vision was still blurry, but he was alive. The battle in the chamber was over. The few surviving hunters had retreated through passages that led back to the canyon, and the Allied forces were securing the area. The massive hunter leader lay motionless near the platform, its shadow form dissipated, and its weapon reduced to smoking fragments. "Is it finished?" Jake asked weakly, as Lyra helped him sit up. "This battle is finished," the Zephyrian commander said, approaching them with several other alien leaders. "But the war is just beginning. The network you have restored will allow us to coordinate our efforts across the entire galaxy. For the first time in millennia, we have real hope of defeating the hunters completely." Lyra smiled, tears of relief streaming down her face. "You did it, Jake. You saved not just my world, but countless others. The source is now accessible to every civilization in the network, and the knowledge stored there will help us rebuild everything we lost." As Jake slowly regained his strength, the various alien leaders took turns thanking him and explaining the next phases of their campaign against the hunters. But what struck him most was how they all treated him as an equal despite his relatively primitive origins. The awakening process had not just given him access to ancient memories and abilities. It had transformed him into something new, a bridge between his human heritage and the cosmic community his ancestors had once been part of. Over the next several hours, Jake learned about the new reality he had helped create. The Threshold Network would serve as a command center for the Galactic Alliance, coordinating military actions, scientific research, and cultural exchange on a scale never before achieved. Earth would once again take its place among the star-faring civilizations, though it would take time for the rest of humanity to adjust to these revelations. As for Jake himself, he faced a choice. The Zephyrian commander offered him a place among their people, where he could learn to fully control his awakened abilities and help guide the coming reconstruction. Alternatively, he could remain on Earth and serve as a liaison between humanity and the larger galactic community. "What about you?" he asked Lyra as they stood together on the platform, watching the alien leaders make preparations for their departure. "Will you return to your homeworld now that the crisis is over?" Lyra was quiet for a long moment, her violet eyes reflecting the light of the still active star map above them. "My world is dying, Jake. Even with access to the source, it may be too late to save it. But there will be other worlds to help, other civilizations to guide and protect. The work we began here today will continue for decades to come." "Other Civen," she turned to face him, and Jake saw something in her expression that made his heart race. "I had hoped that you might consider joining that effort. The bond we formed during the awakening process, the way our minds touched and worked together, that was not just a temporary necessity. We are connected now, in ways that transcend species barriers." Jake looked around the ancient chamber, at the symbols that now seemed as familiar as his own handwriting, at the alien beings who had accepted him as one of their own. Then he thought about Thunder, still waiting patiently somewhere outside the threshold, and the cattle ranch where his simple life had begun just days ago. But when he met Lyra's gaze again, he realized the choice had already been made. The moment he had first touched her restraints in the desert, his old life had ended and a new one had begun. He was no longer just Jake Morrison, cowboy from Dusty Creek. He was something new, something that belonged as much to the stars as to the earth beneath his feet. "The galaxy is a big place," he said, taking her hand in his. "I suppose someone needs to make sure all these different worlds can work together without destroying each other." Lyra's smile was brighter than the light of distant stars. "Then come with me, Jake Morrison. Let me show you wonders beyond anything your ancestors ever dreamed of. Together, we can build something better than what existed before." something that will ensure the darkness never returns. As they prepared to leave the threshold and begin their journey among the stars, Jake took one last look at the chamber where everything had changed. The consciousness patterns of the ancient builders flickered one final time, as if bidding farewell, and then faded back into the stone that held their memories. Outside, thunder was indeed waiting, along with a small ship that had appeared as if from nowhere. It was sleek and beautiful, clearly of Zephyrian design, with hull plates that shifted color in the desert sunlight. As Jake led his horse toward the vessel, he knew that this would be their last ride together across the familiar landscapes of Earth. But as the ship lifted off and the desert fell away beneath them, Jake felt no sadness for what he was leaving behind. Instead, he felt the same excitement that his ancestors must have experienced when they first looked up at the night sky and wondered what lay among the stars. The universe was vast and full of mysteries, but it was no longer empty. It was home to countless civilizations, working together to build something greater than any one world could achieve alone. And at the center of it all was the love he had found with an alien girl, whose tears had first moved him to compassion, but whose strength and courage had awakened possibilities he had never dreamed existed. Together, they would explore the infinite reaches of space, ensuring that the light of hope never again dimmed in the face of darkness.